AZLAN ADNAN, MA presents How Much Protein Should We Actually Eat? Clearing the Confusion Around Quantity, Quality, Aging Muscles, and Everyday Needs, Monday, 17 August 2026. Have you noticed subtle changes in your body over the last few years that leave you feeling sluggish, uncomfortable, or frustrated? Perhaps stubborn fat has accumulated around your midsection and refuses to shift. Your muscles may feel softer even though you remain reasonably active. Strength seems to slip, recovery takes longer, and the habits that kept you lean and strong in your 30s and 40s no longer seem to work quite as well. Social media has made the problem worse. One voice tells you to eat enormous amounts of steak, eggs, and protein powder to preserve muscle. Another warns that protein accelerates aging and should be restricted. A third insists that protein barely matters if you eat a plant-based diet. The result is often anxiety rather than understanding. The reality is considerably more nuanced. Protein requirements vary according to age, body size, physical activity, training status, energy intake, and overall diet. The amount required to prevent deficiency is not necessarily the same as the amount that may be useful for preserving muscle during aging, resistance training, or weight loss. Once that distinction is understood, much of the apparent controversy disappears. What protein actually does? Protein is not simply a bodybuilding nutrient. It is the raw material from which the body constructs and maintains muscle, enzymes, hormones, transport proteins, antibodies, and numerous other structures. Proteins are continually being broken down and rebuilt in a process known as protein turnover. Protein itself is made from amino acids. 9 of these are considered essential because the human body cannot synthesize them in sufficient quantities and therefore must obtain them from food. The familiar recommended dietary allowance, or RDA, for protein in healthy adults is approximately 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight per day. For someone weighing 70 kilograms, that works out to about 56 grams of protein a day. But there is an important caveat. The RDA is fundamentally a population-level target designed to provide sufficient protein for most healthy adults and prevent deficiency. It should not automatically be interpreted as the ideal intake for every person in every circumstance. There is a difference between adequate and optimal. The question for an older adult who wants to preserve muscle while exercising and perhaps losing body fat is not simply, am I getting enough protein to avoid deficiency? It is, am I getting enough protein to support the physiological goal I am asking my body to achieve? That is a different question. The aging muscle, anabolic resistance. One of the most important changes that occurs with aging is a gradual reduction in the responsiveness of skeletal muscle to anabolic stimuli. This phenomenon is known as anabolic resistance. It does not begin suddenly on a particular birthday. Rather, it develops progressively and is influenced by aging itself as well as physical inactivity, inflammation, metabolic dysfunction, illness, and other factors. The result is that an older person's muscles may not respond as strongly to a given quantity of protein or a given bout of exercise as the muscles of a younger person. This matters because muscle is constantly being remodeled. If muscle protein breakdown chronically exceeds muscle protein synthesis, lean tissue gradually declines. The consequences extend well beyond appearance. Loss of muscle can reduce strength, physical independence, metabolic capacity, balance, and resilience. It can also make ordinary activities, from climbing stairs to getting out of a chair, progressively more demanding. But aging does not mean that muscle loss is inevitable. Exercise and nutrition can substantially influence the trajectory. Why resistance training matters so much. Protein provides the amino acids required for muscle maintenance and repair, but amino acids alone are not a complete solution. The strongest practical stimulus for maintaining and building skeletal muscle is progressive resistance exercise. Lifting weights, using resistance bands, performing challenging bodyweight exercises, or otherwise subjecting muscles to progressively increasing loads tells the body that those muscles remain necessary. This is crucial. If you consume more protein without giving your muscles a reason to retain or build tissue, the additional protein does not simply turn into muscle. Once amino acid requirements for tissue maintenance and adaptation have been met, additional amino acids may be oxidized for energy or channeled into other metabolic pathways. Protein is therefore better understood as building material, not as a magical muscle-building substance. Exercise provides much of the signal, protein provides much of the substrate. The two work together. So how much protein do we actually need? There is no single number that is optimal for everyone. For a healthy sedentary adult, approximately 0.8 to 1.0 grams per kilogram today may be adequate. For someone who is physically active, an intake around 1.0 to 1.2 grams per kilogram today may be more appropriate. For many older adults, people undertaking regular resistance training, or individuals deliberately reducing calories while attempting to preserve lean mass, 1.2 to 1.6 grams per kilogram today is a reasonable practical range. The upper end may be particularly useful during calorie restriction or periods of substantial resistance training. Consider a 70-kilogram person. At 1.2 grams per kilogram, the daily intake would be approximately 84 grams. At 1.6 grams per kilogram, it would be approximately 112 grams. That is considerably more than the 56 grams represented by the conventional 0.8 grams per kilogram RDA. But it is still very different from consuming enormous quantities of protein simply because more seems better. There is no strong reason for most healthy adults to assume that progressively increasing protein indefinitely will produce progressively greater benefits. What about 2.0 or 2.2 grams per kilogram? Higher protein targets are sometimes recommended in sports nutrition, particularly for resistance-trained individuals pursuing maximal muscle hypertrophy or trying to preserve lean mass during aggressive calorie restriction. Figures approaching 2.0 to 2.2 grams per kilogram today therefore have a legitimate place in certain athletic contexts, but they should not automatically be transplanted into the lives of ordinary adults. A 70-kilogram recreationally active person does not necessarily need 154 grams of protein every day simply because a competitive bodybuilder might benefit from a high-protein diet. Protein requirements exist on a continuum. The objective should be to consume enough rather than to win a competition for consuming the most. Quantity versus quality. The amount of protein matters, but so does the protein's amino acid composition and digestibility. Animal foods such as meat, fish, eggs, and dairy generally contain all 9 essential amino acids in proportions that are favorable for human protein synthesis, and many are highly digestible. Plant proteins can differ in their amino acid profiles and digestibility. That does not mean that plant proteins are nutritionally inadequate. Legumes, soy foods, grains, nuts, seeds, and vegetables collectively provide substantial amounts of protein, and a varied plant-based diet can readily supply all essential amino acids when total food intake is adequate. There is also no requirement to combine complementary proteins at every individual meal. The body maintains and recycles amino acids continuously, so what matters is the overall dietary pattern. Nevertheless, protein quality can become more relevant when food intake is restricted or when trying to maximize the anabolic response to a particular meal. This is one reason soy foods such as tofu, tempeh, and edamame are particularly useful in plant-forward diets. They provide substantial protein together with a favorable essential amino acid profile. The leucine question. One amino acid deserves special attention: leucine. Leucine is one of the branched-chain amino acids and acts as an important signaling molecule involved in the regulation of muscle protein synthesis, partly through the mTORC1 pathway. Older muscle may require a stronger nutritional stimulus to produce the same anabolic response as younger muscle. This is one reason that simply spreading tiny quantities of protein across the day may not be the most effective strategy for an older person attempting to preserve muscle. A substantial serving of a protein-rich food at each main meal may be more useful. However, there is no universally applicable magic number of grams of leucine that every person must consume at every meal. Body size, protein source, age, exercise, and overall diet all influence the response. The practical lesson is simpler. Do not merely ask whether a food contains protein. Ask whether the meal provides a meaningful amount of high-quality protein. Does protein have to come from animal foods? No. This is one of the most persistent misconceptions in nutrition. A well-planned plant-based diet can provide sufficient protein. Beans, lentils, chickpeas, peas, tofu, tempeh, edamame, seitan, whole grains, nuts, and seeds can all contribute. The important issue is dietary adequacy. Someone eating enormous quantities of low-calorie vegetables but very little energy overall may struggle to consume enough protein. Someone eating a varied diet containing legumes, soy foods, grains, nuts, and seeds generally has far less difficulty. For plant-based eaters, increasing protein intake does not necessarily require protein powders. Often, it simply means making legumes or soy foods a more deliberate component of meals. Protein and weight loss. The protein question becomes particularly interesting when calories are being restricted. During weight loss, the body does not exclusively lose fat. Some lean tissue can also be lost. That is undesirable because the objective of successful weight reduction should be to reduce excess fat while preserving as much metabolically useful lean tissue as possible. Adequate protein combined with resistance training can help. This is why a person eating fewer calories may sometimes have a greater practical need for protein than someone consuming sufficient calories to maintain body weight. The answer is not to eat unlimited protein. It is to make the available calories nutritionally efficient. Should we spread protein across the day? For muscle maintenance, the distribution of protein may matter, particularly in older adults. Rather than consuming almost all of the day's protein in one enormous evening meal, it is reasonable to distribute substantial servings across 2, 3, or 4 meals. A practical target might be roughly 25 to 40 grams per meal, adjusted for body size and the protein source, but this should be viewed as a useful framework rather than a biological law. A 50-kilogram person and a 100-kilogram person should not necessarily eat identical quantities. The principle is more important than the number. Give your muscles several meaningful opportunities during the day to receive amino acids rather than concentrating virtually all protein into a single feeding. What about IGF-1 and mTOR? This is where the protein debate becomes more complicated. Protein and certain amino acids stimulate signaling pathways, including mTOSes, while dietary protein can also influence IGF-1. These pathways are involved in growth, repair, metabolism, and cellular maintenance. Consequently, it is tempting to conclude that stimulating them must necessarily accelerate aging. That conclusion is too simplistic. The same biological pathways that can promote growth and proliferation are also necessary for maintaining muscle and repairing tissues. The objective is not to eliminate mTOR centers or suppress every anabolic response. An older person needs anabolic signaling. Without it, muscle deteriorates. The more meaningful question is one of dose, context, timing, and long-term dietary pattern. A reasonable protein intake combined with exercise is fundamentally different from chronic overnutrition, obesity, physical inactivity, and a diet dominated by highly processed foods. This is also why the protein debate cannot be separated from the broader question of dietary quality, what the experts actually agree on. The apparent disagreement between nutrition experts is often greater on social media than it is in the scientific literature. Researchers and clinicians may differ in emphasis, particularly over the optimal intake for particular populations. Sports nutrition specialists tend to favor higher intakes when the objective is maximal muscle development. Plant-based nutrition researchers may place greater emphasis on overall dietary quality, fiber, and the health effects of the foods accompanying protein. Geriatric and clinical nutrition specialists are particularly concerned with preserving muscle and function during aging and illness. These are not necessarily mutually exclusive positions. The central point is that protein requirements are context-dependent. An elite strength athlete, a sedentary 30-year-old, a physically active 70-year-old, and an older adult recovering from illness are not physiologically identical. Their protein requirements should not be expected to be identical either. The kidney question. Another common source of confusion is the relationship between protein and kidney health. People with established chronic kidney disease may need an individually tailored protein intake, depending on the stage and characteristics of their disease. That is a clinical question. It does not mean that a moderately higher protein intake automatically damages the kidneys of healthy people. The distinction is important. People with kidney disease should obtain individual medical or dietetic advice rather than blindly adopting a high-protein diet from social media. Healthy people, meanwhile, should not assume that eating a sensible amount of protein is inherently harmful simply because extremely high-protein diets are inappropriate for some clinical populations. The real protein paradox. The protein paradox is not that scientists cannot decide whether protein is good or bad. It is that the same nutrient can be appropriate at one dose and unnecessary at another, beneficial in one context and less useful in another. Protein is essential. Too little is a problem. More is not automatically better. The RDA of 0.8 grams per kilogram today remains an important reference point, but it should not be mistaken for a universal optimization target. For many healthy adults over 50, particularly those who exercise, a practical intake around 1.2 to 1.6 grams per kilogram today is a more useful starting point. People undertaking serious resistance training may require more. People who are sedentary may require less. People with certain medical conditions require individualized advice, and everyone benefits from considering the quality of the foods delivering the protein. The bigger picture, perhaps the most important lesson, is that protein should not be viewed in isolation. A person cannot compensate for chronic inactivity simply by drinking protein shakes, nor can a high-protein diet compensate for inadequate sleep, excessive calorie intake, poor dietary quality, or a complete absence of resistance exercise. Muscle is living tissue. It responds to mechanical loading, nutritional availability, hormones, energy balance, inflammation, and age. If you want to preserve it, you must address the system rather than obsess over a single nutrient. Lift something, move regularly, eat enough protein, distribute it sensibly, choose predominantly nutrient-dense foods, maintain an appropriate energy balance, and give your body a reason to keep the muscle you already have. The bottom line, for most healthy adults, 0.8 grams per kilogram today is a minimum adequacy target, not necessarily an optimal target for aging, athletic performance, or muscle preservation. For many active adults and people over 50, 1.2 to 1.6 grams per kilogram today provides a sensible, practical range. The precise number matters less than the broader strategy. Protein quality matters. Total energy intake matters. Resistance training matters enormously. Protein distribution may matter increasingly with age, and very high protein intake is not automatically superior to a moderate, well-designed intake. The goal is not to consume as much protein as possible. The goal is to consume enough of the right protein in the right context while giving your muscles the stimulus to use it. Aging does not make muscle loss inevitable, but preserving muscle does require intention. The winning strategy is not a protein obsession. It is the combination of adequate protein, progressive resistance training, sufficient movement, and an overall diet capable of supporting long-term health. The author has placed this work in the public domain. It may be freely imported, exported, shared, distributed, edited, modified, or reformatted without explicit consent from the author. As a visually impaired person, the author asserts his rights under the Marrakesh Treaty to facilitate access to published works for persons who are blind, visually impaired, or otherwise print disabled. 2013, wipo.int.
Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel to show your support.